Hi everyone, welcome to DreamFactory. My name is Ben Busse. I'm a product manager with DreamFactory, and in this introductory screencast, I'm going to walk you through DreamFactory with a quick 5-minute demo to help you get started. Before we get started with the demo, a quick overview of what DreamFactory is. So DreamFactory is an open source mobile backend that provides RESTful services for building modern applications. So in this diagram, DreamFactory is everything in orange. DreamFactory automatically generates a comprehensive, customizable, and secure REST API for any backend data source, including SQL, NoSQL, file storage, remote web services, email, push notifications, and more. DreamFactory is really a complete backend for RESTful application development. There are a bunch of features in the platform, including server-side scripting, security controls like single sign-on, user management, record-level access control, interactive live API docs, and client SDKs. And we're going to talk about all of that real quickly so it's easy for you to get started with the product. Okay, so now we'll hop into a quick product demo, and I'll show you some of the key features that you'll want to understand before starting with your development with DreamFactory. So here you're looking at the Admin Console. So the Admin Console is a user interface where you configure everything in DreamFactory. So I'm currently logged in as an administrator. Administrators have full access to the system. And I'm going to walk through some of the key use cases. So along the top, you have a navigation bar with a bunch of different options. We'll be covering most of these quickly today. And then along the side is a sidebar. So each of these options in the parent nav has an associated sidebar where you can just navigate through the user interface. So one thing that's important is before you get started, I suggest checking out the resources. So we have a bunch of online resources to learn about the product in a lot more detail than this quick screencast, including community forum, some tutorials, a number of different blog posts, and the links to contact our support team if you have specific technical questions. The other thing to point out is there's a download link here where you can go and actually install the product. So if you've gone to dreamfactory.com and signed up, you like the product, you want to use it, it's very easy to go get it and install it. It's open source, it's a LAMP stack. You can install it on a server, you can install it in the cloud, you can install it on your laptop, and all of the instructions for that are right here. So I'm going to walk through the rest of the demo in a specific order. I'm going to talk about services first. I'm going to talk about what the API docs are and how DreamFactory auto-generates APIs for you so that you can use in your application development. I'll then jump into scripts, what server-side scripting is and how it works at a high level. We'll jump into users and roles and talk about the role-based access control and how you lock down security. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with a little bit of overview of some of the other tabs. So the heart of DreamFactory, as you saw in the earlier diagram, is really the services area. So you think of DreamFactory as a runtime middleware. It provides automatically generated, completely reusable APIs that many different applications can use. So the idea is instead of having to write your own APIs from scratch each and every time you're developing a new application, you can unlock data and expose it RESTfully, and then any application developer to whom you give permission can actually develop applications, and then end users can use the applications that you've built and just call the API with security totally baked in. So here you're looking at what we call services. These are basically the configuration settings for a bunch of data that we've connected to and that we have APIs for within DreamFactory. So here's a list. There's SQL databases, NoSQL databases, file storage, and so forth. And you can add as many of these services as you want in an instance of DreamFactory. And any applications can then use those services. So it's very easy to set up a new service. You have a catalog of different options. It ranges from all the way from Active Directory and LDAP down to database vendors, both NoSQL and SQL. The leading file storage, remote file storage options are there, such as S3, which is very popular. Email, you can easily configure for a REST API for email. Push notifications, started with Amazon. We'll be adding more of those to the catalog soon. And then OAuth, so adding single sign-on with Facebook, GitHub, Google, and Twitter. And lastly, remote web services. So this is a REST API that, say, you've already built or that already exists, and you want to connect to it with your app securely. You can add that remote web service here. You can also write custom services with a custom scripting service, which I'll talk about. So you simply select the type of service that you want to add. Classic example is a SQL database. You give the service a name. This is the API name that you want to give it. It can be anything. A label that's human readable and that you'll remember what it is, and then a short description optionally. And then you simply fill out these forms. And this is the same paradigm for any service that you want to add. So what's the driver, let's say, or the type of database? It might be MySQL. Here's a connection string. Give it the right port. Give it the database name you want to connect to. Put in your database credentials, username and password, and various other options that are optional. And then you can create the service. And what DreamFactory is doing is it's automatically saving the credentials securely on the server. Never want to do that on the client. And it's automatically inspecting the service or the schema, let's say it's a SQL database, and providing a set of automatically generated endpoints that are instantly ready to use. So this REST API is pre-built, ready to use, and totally reusable without writing any code at all. It just works. So that's, in a nutshell, the paradigm for adding a service. Once you've added your services, you can go back and manage them here, and you can then hop into the API docs. The API docs are really where you're looking at what the services do, learning about the various API endpoints, and ultimately writing your application. So this is interactive live API documentation, and I'll show you some quick examples. You have a bunch of abstract endpoints that are automatically generated. They're parameterized, so you can pass in table names, field names, particular IDs from your application. It's quite comprehensive in terms of what it supports. So it supports tables, it supports views, it supports stored procedures, functions, and you can also operate on schema in the database example. And as you browse this, what you'll notice is that the other services such as MongoDB are really just a direct subset of the SQL API calls, right? So NoSQL is really, in a way, just a stripped down version of SQL. You don't have relationships, you don't have things like stored procedures, but the path structure of the API is really the same as SQL. And so this is important because it allows you like a lot of flexibility and portability. You can swap out SQL databases to NoSQL databases. You can decide that you want to change vendors on a NoSQL database really easily. And the API endpoints are really the same. It's just a different name, but all the API calls structurally are identical. And then lastly, you'll notice that S3 is a kind of a direct subset of NoSQL. So here you have the same types of endpoints, but you're operating on folders and files, but there's nothing radically different structurally. Now, when you're looking through this, you'll want to pick some to start playing with when you want to get started. So let's say you've connected to your database that's running somewhere, maybe behind a firewall in your corporate data center on Amazon, wherever it's running. You have some data in there and you want to look at it. So the first thing you want to do is to start playing with some of these API calls. And a good thing to do is to start just trying to retrieve some records is what I generally recommend. So you can hop into an API call like db_table and then table name. DreamFactory, once you've created that services connection here, inspects the schema, sees what's there, so you can pick a particular table you want to look at, and then you start appending some parameters. So I can put in, I don't know, a SQL-like parameter such as something simple here for the sake of an example. And then you can add other parameters, like maybe we want to limit this set of results to 10 or something just to see what's there. You can put in sort order, you can put in offsets for pagination. There are a whole bunch of parameters, and these ultimately all get appended to the end of the API call. So the idea here is that you can basically make API calls, they're highly reusable, and you can instantly see the data and start interacting with it. So here I'm going to try it out. And the point of this is to see the structure of both the request URL on the request to your server, and then obviously the response body, in this case coming back as JSON. So you'll see the endpoint, which is the URL here. It's localhost/API/v2, and you can follow along here. I've named this particular API DB, and then you just follow the path here, and it pretty much is pretty logical to follow, pretty straightforward. Here the object name is contact. And then after the question mark, I have a bunch of key value pairs. These are just simply the parameters that I've passed in. A filter string. These can be compound filter strings, basically SQL-like operators that you want to put in there and segment the data. and then you can string these together in any fashion. So here I put a limit if I wanted to add a sort order, if I wanted to add a comma delimited list of fields, if I wanted to do something for example, put in related, I could do that. This will go get all of the child records to do relationships, that kind of thing. And quickly you're just seeing data come back, and you can quickly master the key parts of the API before you get started with your application development. So that in a very quick summary is everything that, not everything, but most things you need to know about starting to use the API. So the next thing I'll jump into is scripts. I want to quickly talk about that. So the API is great for operating and making calls and getting data back. For simple applications, that's great. You don't necessarily have to do anything else. For more advanced use cases, you generally have to put business logic, things like field validation, workflow rules, like you want to implement things on the server, and you don't want to do that on the client. And so this very much follows that model. Each API endpoint has events, and you can add scripts either on the request and or the response to any API call. And we call these things event scripts. There are two flavors of scripts. There are custom scripts, which I'll talk about after this, and there are event scripts. Event scripts are very simple. You go to the endpoint. I'll take an example. Let's say that you want to do some simple field validation. So you want to make sure that some fields that are getting filled out by a user in a form are non-null. So have to have data, and you want to implement that not only on the client, that kind of control validation, but also on the server. So you could go to a particular endpoint. I have an API called DB. I can navigate down to the particular API call. It could be a general API call that happens for every table that you want to implement the script on, or it can be a particular table. So let's say that I want to go down and do a post, and it's, let's say, the contact object. So there's a bunch of contacts. I'm building a little micro CRM or address book application, mobile app, and when people enter contacts, I want to make sure that certain data is always there. So what I can do is look at the different verbs here. This is going to be on a post, so I can hop down to the contact object, DB, table, contact, post is the verb, and I actually want to pre-process this API call. So here I can write some logic. So this uses the V8 JavaScript engine, which is sandboxed and comes pre-installed with DreamFactory. You can also invoke other scripts. So you can write PHP, or you can have a node server running on the same environment as DreamFactory is running in, and then you can invoke that script directly and call it. So you have a few options. We'll be expanding this list over time. This is the key way to implement server-side logic. You can also do it in the other direction, which is post-processing. So likewise, if on that post, let's say that I want to kick off some kind of workflow rule, like a push notification if some condition occurred, on the DB table contact post-process, I can go in here and implement the same kind of logic, not on the request, but on the response. So here we'll create a variable, and then we'll push some data using Amazon SNS, and it will alert somebody that a record got inserted, or whatever the rule is, right? You can implement any type of business rules programmatically with server-side scripts. So that's scripting in a nutshell. The other thing I'll point out just really quickly, so people are aware of it, is you can write custom scripts, and I didn't show that before, but if you go into this user interface, you can basically create APIs from scratch if you need to do that. So give it a name and a label, and then in the config, you can implement code. So pick, PHP, Node, or V8, write a routine, some code, and then you can bring in different libraries. Like if there are external libs that your script requires, then you can reference those paths in here. And we'll be providing a bunch of tutorials. It's easiest to learn this stuff by example. So that will be coming out as of this screencast. It's September 2015. It should be out in October. So look forward to that information. So that's services in a nutshell and scripts. And now I'm going to talk about roles and users. So the role system is important. The key construct here is that all of the services that you created in those APIs shouldn't be open to the world. You want to put role-based access control on them. And the way you do that is by creating roles. So roles are typically for end users that are accessing your API from the applications you're building. generally you're writing a lot of code to do this, but DreamFactory lets you basically configure that role-based access control just with straight configuration without having to write code. So here I've created a simple role. This is one of the sample applications we provide called an address book for iOS. And before I fired up an Xcode and everything, I want to make sure that the API is secure. So I can go here, and for that particular address book application, there are 4 database objects that the app requires. And what I want to do is make sure that I have proper role-based access governance on the data. So here's where you determine all of that. By default, roles don't have any access. You have to open that access up. So basically all of the services show up here, like database or MongoDB or whatever services you set up will show up in this list. And then you can basically specify the permissions. So here, a very simple use case, contact object. I want to open this up and let users create, read, update, and delete the data. And I want to allow access to the script, the field validation, and the workflow. I can open up access to the API and or the script. So I'm doing that. And then I want to do that for the various other objects. There's some relationships here by foreign keys. So there's a notion of contact groups, contact group relationship, and contact info are separate database objects. And I need to declare that these are available for end users. So that's how you set up a role. The other thing is role-based access control. So here what you can do is, in addition to table-level access control, you can specify rules that govern for a given table what records an end user can access. So here for this role, I'm going to say, let's say that there's a field called owner ID. I want to ensure that the user is logged in can't create, read, update, delete other users' records. So I'll declare that the owner ID must be equal to the user ID of the authenticated user with the session, and that's all enforced by DreamFactory automatically on the server. So you'll get API errors if you try to break those rules. So that's important to understand from a config perspective. There are also lookup keys. That's a bit more of an advanced feature. You can inherit permissions from an existing database. I won't get too much into the details, but if you have existing role-based access control in your SQL database, you can set up lookup keys and enforce the rules with field-level access, with record-level access control as well. So that's the role system. End users can get programmatically created in your sign-up process and managed. You can also manage them within the user interface. So when you go to create a user, you do that from your application if you have open registration enabled, or if you're administering it here, you can do that. And then users have a set of roles, so for each application. So here I can grant this user access to the iOS address book, and each application you can basically decide what is that user's role. So this is important because applications can actually have multiple roles. If you have different levels of permission in your app for different types of users, you just need to specify for that particular end user, okay, what's the person's role for the particular app. And of course, this is all available in the API docs as well. So you'll see that the system and the user has a complete comprehensive API for managing all of that config. So that's the important thing to understand from users and roles. Quickly jump into apps. So it's important to understand that DreamFactory is for building more than one application. You could just do one application, but it's really more of a platform for building many applications. So when you first install it, you'll notice that there's some apps in here. Swagger is the API doc, so that's actually an application that can run independently, and you can give different role permissions to Swagger itself. So you can make part of your public API totally public if you want, or private, or parts of it private, parts of it public, that kind of thing. The file manager, I'll mention in a moment, is where you manage files in the local file system. That itself has a front end. It's an app, and it's in the list. It's also here. And then you'll just be adding applications. And the way you add an application is very simple. You go to create, you give the app a name and a description. DreamFactory automatically generates an API key, which is just a long string. DreamFactory uses stateless session management with JSON Web Tokens, JWT. So your API calls need to have an API key in them. And you can also associate a default role with an app. So sometimes you may want your application to be public or parts of it public. And if so, you can specify a role for public access. And this is basically access without any authentication. You specify that here. Applications, there are lots of different flavors. You can run the application on a remote URL and enable cores for that to access the endpoints. You can run a web application on this web server where DreamFactory is running in the file system. You can run it on some other file storage system, or if it's like a native mobile application, for example, there is no storage. You're just accessing the endpoints through the wire. So you need to specify where the applications, actually the binaries, are going to physically reside. You can import applications, and this is a good, as an example, we recommend importing, for your first app, import one of these address book applications. The app will be in there, the API key will be generated, and then when you go here, what you can do is download one of the SDKs. So like for this address book app, I can go here, and this will open up an SDK, and you can follow the directions for how to get this application up and running, and open it up in Xcode and see how it all works. It's best to kind of understand it by example. So that's apps in a nutshell. The last thing I'll cover quickly are the other tabs. Admins are administrators of the system, so those are separate from users. Users really mean end users that are accessing applications running on DreamFactory. Roles, services we talked about. Schema really covers database schema. So DreamFactory comes with a default database. It can be MySQL. You can also connect to, or the default database can be some other vendor if you want, and this is where the system tables, the user tables, the roles, the scripts are actually stored. So here, when you connect to a database, whether it's the local database that DreamFactory has or a remote database, you simply select the service and select the table. In this case, I'm not connected to this particular database is empty, but normally there'd be a list of tables here, and you can see the schema and you can actually operate on it if you want from within this user interface. Data is simply the data that's residing in the database, so it's similar to schema. So you select your database and the table, and it will show up there. Files is a user interface for managing files and folders that are on the local file system. So again, scenario here is you're building a web application. It is an app here, and you want to upload folders and files, HTML files, etc. You could also store things like images and such if you're building a mobile application, and those can live in the local file system or to something like S3 that you've already connected to. So the last thing I'll cover is the config area and packages. Config, there are a bunch of options here. You'll see the version that you're on. You'll see caching. You'll see cores, so you can flush the cache if you want. Cores is basically whitelisting IP addresses. So for example, if you're running your app remotely, you can give it an IP address, and that will open up access to the endpoints. There are email templates which provide pre-built functionality for user invites, for signing up users, for password recovery, and so forth. Global lookup keys, which are a more advanced feature for inheriting permissions from remote systems such as databases, and then various preferences for this user interface. Lastly, packages. You can decide that you want to import or export rather an application from dev to test to production. You can select an app, include the app files, select the schema that you want to export, and then the various services upon which that app relies, and then you can export it all as an executable file, and then you can then go into the apps tab and then import that same, you can browse for that package file, the executable, and then import it, and the app will run in the new instance where you want to import it. So that is DreamFactory in a nutshell. Log in and log out in the upper right hand corner. I will point out one other thing, Launchpad. So this is a place where you can launch applications. If I'm not an administrator, let's say I'm a regular user, I can go to this URL, and actually if I have permissions to see the application, I can then launch it directly from this user interface. So that's DreamFactory in a nutshell. Remember, you can try it for free on dreamfactory.com. You can then download it from any of these links and check out the resources here if you have questions or need help. And I hope this was useful, and best of luck with your development with DreamFactory. Thanks.